Welcome, friends, to the Friends General Conference Institutional Assessment on Racism update. I'll talk a little about the motivation for doing this institutional assessment, Crossroads, the organization who trained us on how to do this institutional assessment, the data that we're gathering, and the testimonies of friends, and the kind of analysis that we'll do. Most importantly, I want to make sure you know how you can participate here at Gathering. The FGC Institutional Assessment on Racism. How did we get here? Well, it was a confluence of events. Much of it started during the gathering in 2016 at St. Ben's in Minnesota. Multiple friends of color were targeted by campus police and felt tokenized by being asked to sit on the opening facing bench. Friends also felt that they were being slighted by microaggressions. And this wasn't anything new. Similar incidents had occurred in past years. At the same time, some friends of European descent who had been involved in anti-racism workshops in prior years were talking about starting a petition. This petition got endorsement by the People of Color Center. They were circulated around at the gathering, and then after the gathering, using electronic means, additional names were collected. More than 350 names were on this petition by the time it was presented to Central Committee fall 2016. And Central Committee agreed that the FGC response to these kinds of incidents, these responses were not living up to our goal of creating the beloved community. So what is the assessment trying to answer? The fundamental question, does institutional racism show up in our FGC organization? And if so, what can we do to address it? Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizing and Training Consulting Group are going to assist us in finding this answer. This is my 3Fs video. What I felt, what I found, and what I feel related to the workshop on institutional assessment that was presented by Crossroads. I felt anxious at the beginning and a little worried about how it would be received, the workshop. I found that the Crossroads folks were totally on their game and that the workshop participants were fully engaged, and now I feel hopeful that the institutional assessment will bring about anti-racist transformation to FGC. So what is racism? Well, it's a loaded word in our culture. Crossroads define racism as a combination of racial prejudice, which is what most people think of first. But they also coupled this with the misuse of power by systems and institutions. This definition of racism is at the heart of our work. So perhaps we should tease out a little bit about these different ideas of racism. Individual racism is usually what people think of. Unfortunately, this is what takes place oftentimes in our national dialogue on race. Discussions around racism can quickly devolve into name-calling. This is not the work we are attempting to address with this institutional assessment. Consider a recent cartoon in the New Yorker. Little Red Riding Hood is seen visiting her grandmother, who's wearing an All Lives Matter t-shirt. Red says, "My, what a blind spot for institutionalized racism you have, Grandma." Indeed, Grandma may innocently believe that all lives do matter. However, she seems unaware that our society does not treat people so equally. Conscious or not, unequal treatment based on race is the nature of institutional racism. It's maybe a little easier to see what institutional racism looks like on a national scale. And while it may be unconscious, it has real consequences. Demonizing those trying to draw attention to the consequences of institutional racism ensures that the conversation stops before it starts. And that seems to be a lot of what's going on around poor Colin Kaepernick in this cartoon. You see the finger shaking, how disgusting it is that he's down on one knee, and we can ignore all the black bodies killed by police in the background. Well, what we're going to do, though, is to try to find institutional racism of this ilk within FGC. At the beginning of the Crossroads workshop, there was a 6-word essay we were asked to put together, and each of our 7 tables came up with a few words. Why is it important for FGC to address institutional racism was the challenge. One group said systemic racism destroys our humanity. Another, racism poisons the kingdom of God. Another, healthy spirituality demands community enacted intentions. Another, be people, be tradition, act justice. Another group said, welcoming future, transformation, justice, healing, wholeness. And another, racism corrodes the community FGC serves. And finally, embody fullness of a just God. The exercise set the stage for an intense and thoughtful workshop. So looking back at this assessment timeline from 2016 on into 2017, after the circulation of the petition and the go-ahead from Central Committee, there were targeted funds raised to retain Crossroads to do this anti-racism training. And that took, well, from that November on into May of 2017 to raise the funds. And then during that summer, the small group, there were about 8 people sort of working as a working group initially, who went out and recruited a diversity of friends to attend this Crossroad training in November. At the beginning of the workshop, friends were surrounded by newsprint, and we were asked to try to recount racism's history in this country. And the 43 of us in teams of 4 would walk from newsprint to newsprint and put up as many incidents as we could remember of racism's history. We were basically teaching each other what we knew. So I think one of the time frames was from 1492 to about 1800, and the next one was about 1800 to 1900, and then the third was around 1900 to 1973, and then the fourth was 72 to present. What was interesting for me anyway was that friends were consistently and continuously drawn to try to complete the lower half of these newsprints, which was actually the resistance to racism. And we all wanted to recount what we remembered that went right, but it was actually quite painful to try to fill out the top halves. And Crossroads trainers tried to hold us back from documenting the resistant portion until the end of the third day.
When we began the institutional assessment workshop process, I felt a little bit unsure as to what we would find, what we would learn, and what we would experience. As we went through the process, I found that I was deeply inspired by what took place there, by the messages that we heard from others, by the history that we explored, and by the real candor and openness and honesty that we had with one another in the process of doing a very intensive workshop. By the end of the time, I felt very inspired, ready to move forward, excited about the process, and hopeful about the future of the Religious Society of Friends and the work that we're doing to explore our own institutionalized racism.
Well, the workshop not only involved learning, but also practicing. They had us up on our feet, practicing various, the framework basically that they were trying to teach us, how to use the language, and sort of imagining ourselves already in the position of with collected data and how it would be analyzed. So, encircled by this history of racism, we practice and institutional assessment process. And as we learned, we practice, and we learned, and we practice. One more perspective on what the process was like.
My 3 F's. How I felt going into the workshop was curious. I looked at it as a learning opportunity, and I had heard about the quality of the workshops that Crossroads present. So, yes, I was really curious. What I found was that my expectations were surpassed. I especially liked the beginnings of the workshop, where we spent a lot of time putting up on big wall posters the history of racism, including the resistance. And then those posters sat on those walls throughout the entire workshop. So, metaphorically and in a very powerful way, we were immersed in the history of racism in this country. Sometimes during the workshop, I would kind of check out a little bit and just look at those posters and think about really how horrified I was, because the history that I had been taught about this country was only from a white point of view. How I feel? Well, I left the workshop feeling like there was a lot of work ahead of us and that it was another learning opportunity, and that has proven to be true. How do you go about evaluating organization for the kind of systemic racism that we've been talking about? So we learned and we put a lot of work into it. And I am very hopeful for clear recommendations this fall that will help FGC as an organization breathe new life into who we are.
So, what is the goal? Well, obviously, we want to assess institutional racism within FGC and then develop recommendations for Central Committee that could be presented to them this fall of 2018. So, this FGC institutional assessment on racism is gathering evidence right now. Is there evidence of institutional racism? And then whatever evidence is gathered will be analyzed, and the data is analyzed along 3 intersecting convergent paths. There's something called a continuum analysis that I'll describe to greater detail in the next couple of slides. There's something called a power analysis. And then thirdly, a survey analysis. Well, out of the 43 people who attended this workshop, 12 people chose to volunteer to be on the task team. And this task force broke into 3 teams. One to focus on this idea of the continuum, which actually assesses to what degree an organization has moved along an anti-racist transformation scale. And then, and then there's a matrix team, which examines the power and structure and where basically that sits and where is it centered. And they'll use FGC records to come up with the evidence of that. And then what you may have already heard about is this survey, because it was launched back on May 1st. And we're trying to collect testimony and perspectives of FGC friends across all that we can touch. So what has happened so far? We actually did some pre-survey focus groups to help inform the survey. We've been collecting these historical records since January, and we'll be wrapping that up in July. There was the development and testing and launching of the survey from March to May. And now we're conducting focus groups here at the gathering. We hope to be able to validate some of the survey open-ended responses with these focus groups. And then in mid-July, we'll actually be analyzing the data collected in all these different ways and trying to sort of cross-validate and come up with findings that will then lead to recommendations. So this continuum analysis, this seems to be the heart of what we learned from Crossroads. We're trying to assess where FGC sits on this continuum of anti-racist transformation. So just to give you an idea of what the continuum is like, I'll start off on the left. This is stage 1. And an organization that would be here on the left would have consolidated power, a hierarchical structure. They would maintain lots of control with binary either or thinking. They would tend to hold a scarcity worldview. There's never enough, and they would try to limit imagination. This tends to use a self-preserving secrecy, holding information very closely to the chest. And it tends to foster competition and a win-lose kind of individualism. Compare that, though, to an organization that might be at stage 3 or 4, where you're starting to see more broadly shared power and a move towards collective action, both and thinking. An organization in this position would tend to have a more abundant worldview and using resources still responsively. It would employ more transparent communication and decision making and would foster more collaboration and cooperation, and that would nurture creativity. So we want to find out, obviously, where does FGC sit on this scale? And the data that we gather should help us to determine that. We actually did practice doing this continuum analysis while at the workshop. And here's one group who thought, well, we're kind of somewhere between a 2 and a 3 with some individuals already at level 4. But of course, an organization has to buy in where you are. So even if we have individuals at level 4, it's the buy-in that's important. And the people felt that the buy-in was probably at the 2 or 3 level. And they were identifying evidence from their own experience that would support that. So now we need more objective evidence to try to help understand where we really sit. And of course, institutional racism is not about individuals, it's about the organization. So the power analysis group wants to assess how FGC imposes and or legitimizes what we might call the white dominant center. And we define what this white dominant center would be sort of in the broader culture at the workshop, and I'll share that with you. But the power analysis basically will examine FGC historical evidence, including the Centennial Book of General Secretaries, Budget and Finance Committee members' annual reports since roughly 1988, looking at who have been the clerks of FGC's committees, look at some of the Committee on Racism data, and obviously some of the gathering locations, which has always been a bit of a sore spot about how the gathering locations may have led to some discomfort for people of color at gathering. So during the workshop, they have us sort of helping us understand who inhabits the quote-unquote white dominant center. What is white dominant centeredness? And who is left out of that? And I've actually transcribed some of what we came up with at the workshop so that it's a little more readable. But you can see your white dominant center is basically a straight white male, cisgender, nuclear family, maybe a couple of kids. They think of themselves as religious. They're citizens of this country, natural born, here in this country, Christian, patriotic, a little militaristic, believers in a market economy, generally operating in a world of niceness, landowning. They have time for vacations and leisure. They share middle-class values, probably own a dog, and they're clearly documented, no issue there, and they're very fit. So, of course, everybody else is outside, and that was an interesting exercise. So we're going to be taking a look at to what degree is FGC operating out of an assumption of and giving power to this white dominant center. And again, what you probably have heard about is the survey, right? Friends are asked to react to some written statements to assess where FGC sits on this continuum of anti-racist transformation. And the statements tend to be very clear about what centers of power might be, or finance, budget, what decision-making is like, how transparent is it or not, what does the organizational structure seem like, do we feel that we promote inclusiveness and welcoming? Is there any kind of conflict engagement process? How do we do conflict resolution? And other such issues. So if you'd like to hear more about the IAR survey, I really would encourage you to participate. We have quite a bit of background that is on the opening welcoming page of the survey. You can read more about what has happened to date, a lot of what we've talked about so far. And you can then continue on and access the survey. You can use a cell phone or a laptop, and you can get it at the surveymonkey.com/r/FGC_IA. Ask for help from one of our folks who are out and about, and we'd be more than willing to point you in the direction of a laptop. I would love to help you. So if you see me, please ask. So that's one way you can get involved. Well, we've got quite a few responses so far, about 930 as of the end of June. At the beginning of June, we had a little over 900. A lot of these charts are from the beginning of June. But we've touched people from across the affiliated yearly meetings. We have also, so let's say it's like 700 from affiliated yearly meetings, about 200 from non-FGC yearly meetings. So we got a nice mix of respondents so far, and that is number one. Our goal is to touch as many people as we can. We've gotten responses at that time of about 36 people who are of African descent. And I'll compare that to, say, 16 Native American, 16 people who say other because they're just a mishmash of this and that, and they don't necessarily identify with any one part of their identity. 682 who identify as being of European descent. Obviously, what I really like to see more people who are not of European descent, so that we can have a better perspective on what it's like to be a non-European, if you will, in this organization. So we'll be continuing to keep the survey open throughout gathering, and we'll also be conducting some focus groups, which we'll talk about in a second. So we've also been tracking how many people who are adult young friends have participated, only about 30. People who identify with FLGBTQC, about 94, and friends who also worship with the Fellowship of Friends of African Descent, about 21, have responded to this survey. So, in addition to having a survey where we're trying to figure out where we sit on this continuum, we're also taking one item on the survey, which is just open-ended. It says, tell me an anecdote or whatever you know, or whatever you would like to, related to institutional assessment on racism. And we have gone through quite a few of those responses multiple times, multiple people, and tried to pull out some of the open-ended items that could require some additional discussion or might spark some interesting discussion. And there will be focus groups here at the gathering on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday at 1:30 and 3:15, where we'll talk through some of those. And we're hoping that you would come. Please sign up. We would love to have you. Come over to the information desk and put your name on the list. We're going to try to keep it to about 12 friends per session, just to keep the conversation lively. But it would be a wonderful problem if we don't have enough scheduled. So please come and sign up. We did do a couple of other focus groups before gathering. There were some at Northern Yearly Meeting Summer Session. There was a focus group at the Ohio Valley Yearly Meeting. There will be some after at New York Yearly Meeting Summer Session. And there were a couple of focus groups at pre-gathering with people of color and also with adult young friends. We hope to even have one with high school students here at the gathering. So we really would like to flesh out some of what we're learning on the survey with greater depth in these focus groups. Please participate. Well, what comes next? After this, we're going to be summarizing the findings and produce a data analysis report. That'll be our goal, to have that done by the end of the July, and to send that report to both all the 12 task force members plus our 2 trainers from Crossroads. And then we will be gathering in August to make some final recommendations, to come up with our final recommendations report, which then will be vetted at the executive committee meeting in September. And then finally, we'll be making a presentation of these recommendations to Central Committee in October. Well, thank you for sitting through this little chat, and I am hoping that you are now motivated to take our institutional assessment on racism survey at surveymonkey.r/FGC_IA, and that you're motivated to sign up for a focus group on institutional racism at the information desk. Thank you so much for taking the time to participate.